David Lewin. I'm Senior Lecturer in Philosophy of Education at Liverpool Hope University. I want to talk a little bit about the complex nature of science and science education. There's a tendency to view science as a set of straightforward, agreed upon facts that we can transmit from those who are in the know to those who need to learn about science. And that image of science as a straightforward transmission is problematic for a number of reasons that I just want to explore a little bit. So the first thing to consider is the fact that there are many diverse meanings to the concept of science, and there's a spectrum of approaches and methods that come under that term. The second thing to consider is that we like to imagine that science is in the business of facts. They're never entirely value-free, these so-called facts themselves, and the statistics can be cut in a number of ways. Moreover, those statistics require a certain level of judgment, not least ethical judgment. So the judgment of science educators is always involved in how they present their statistics. Isn't scientific method really the essence of science? Even here though, it's not straightforward. I mean, the rough view of scientific method, that neat and tidy process doesn't always make sense in certain contexts. So again, the idea that we have a clear-cut scientific method that is equally available to all scientists, itself is a bit simplistic. Okay, we understand that science isn't just fact-based, it doesn't follow a straightforward method, it's a bit more complicated than that. But what does this mean for science education? So we have a responsibility to share some of the complexity with students. Primarily, I would say the reason for that is pedagogical. It is good to teach in a way that engages critical inquiry into data rather than transmitting the truth. The idea that we can simply transmit a set of clean, uninterpreted data to students, not only is that unhelpful because of the complex nature of science, but it also doesn't do justice to the best teaching practices. I still think the principle of engagement holds across all levels, and indeed there's plenty of data that one has to interpret to suggest that students learn best when they're engaged in a complex recognition of judgment and interpretation when it comes to understanding the world. So I think science as a form of education, or science education, needs to consider both the complexity of scientific method but also the best pedagogical practice through engagement. So this idea that transmission is not the best model of learning has been beautifully dealt with by Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens characterises, or should I say caricatures, the teaching strategy which bases itself upon facts. Graminivorous, 40 teeth, namely 24 grinders, 4 eye teeth and 12 incisive. Sheds coat in the spring, in marshy countries, sheds hoofs too. Hoofs hard, but requiring to be shod with iron, age known by marks in mouth. There you have a horse. For many people, that is not the best way to understand a horse. So the point is that education is not best served by an account of simple knowledge transmission, but it requires engagement, and that's what science education needs to consider, and obviously does in many cases. And if we accept that science involves interpretation and judgment, then we need to ask ourselves whose interests are served by the current judgments and interpretations that hold within scientific community. And I think critical theorists today are recognising much, to a greater extent, that colonialism and post-colonialism structure the being of science. We need to really consider how our scientific framing of things leads us to behave in certain ways, both destructive and constructive.